Sometimes you have to destroy a family to save what's left of it, and that day, I had to do it. I am Judge Angela Thompson, 44 years old, Atlanta, Georgia. And today, I'm going to tell you about the case that kept me up at night for months. The case where no matter what I decided, someone was going to come out shattered. Where the law told me one thing, but the eyes of those children begged me for something completely different. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. It was a Tuesday morning when the file arrived on my desk. Custody case. I thought it would be just another one of those you see 100 times a year. But when I started reading, I knew this was different. Very different. The Petersons. Robert and Amanda. Married 12 years. 3 children, Emma, 11, and twins Lucas and Sophia, 8. On paper, a normal middle-class family in the Atlanta suburbs. He an engineer, she a nurse. Nice house, dog included, the perfect picture of American life. But photos lie. Robert was seeking full custody of the 3 children. Amanda opposed, obviously, but what chilled me to the bone was the reason. Robert was not accusing Amanda of abuse or neglect. He was accusing her of something much more complicated, much grayer. Amanda suffered from severe bipolar disorder, diagnosed 6 years ago. And according to Robert, she had stopped taking her medication 8 months ago. The consequences had been catastrophic. The file included school reports. Emma was constantly late, sometimes without lunch packed. The twins had missed important classes. There was an incident where Amanda took the children on a spontaneous trip to Florida at midnight during the school week, without informing anyone, driving 6 hours in a manic state. But there was another side to the coin. Psychological reports showed that during her depressive episodes, Amanda stayed in bed for days. The children, especially Emma, had taken on caregiver roles. An 11-year-old girl making breakfasts, taking her siblings to the bus, lying to teachers about why mom didn't answer the phone. My first instinct was simple: custody to Robert. End of story. But then I read the report from the social worker who visited the home. Robert traveled. A lot. His job kept him out of state 3 weeks every month. For the last 2 years, he had been practically absent. And when he was home, well, let's say he wasn't exactly father of the year. The children barely knew him. Lucas called him the man who sleeps in mom's room to a therapist. Sophia had nightmares when he was home because he yells a lot. Emma admitted she preferred when dad wasn't there because at least mom loves us when she's okay. And there lay the problem. When Amanda was medicated and stable, she was an exceptional mother. The teachers confirmed it. The neighbors confirmed it. Even Robert admitted it in his statement. He said the woman he fell in love with was bright, loving, devoted. But the illness had turned her into someone unrecognizable. The first hearing was brutal. Robert arrived with an expensive suit lawyer, flawless paperwork, lined-up witnesses. Amanda arrived with an overburdened public defender and eyes that hadn't slept in days. You could see the medication working, keeping her stable but also dulled, like a ghost of herself. Her defender argued that Amanda had resumed her treatment, that she was committed to recovery, that the children needed her. Robert argued it was too late. The damage had been done. He couldn't trust she would remain stable. Then I interviewed the children. Always the worst part. Emma went in first. 11 years old, but with the eyes of a 30-year-old. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "My mom is sick, but she's still my mom. My dad's not sick, but he's not here either. Does that count?" It broke my heart. The twins were more complicated. Lucas drew 2 houses in the evaluation therapy session, one colorful with mom inside, but with dark clouds overhead, another gray with dad inside, but empty. Sophia barely spoke, only asking if the decision meant she would never see one of her parents again. I dug deeper. I found out Robert had threatened to divorce 2 years ago if Amanda didn't control herself, that he had minimized her condition in front of the children, calling her dramatic and exaggerated. That once, during one of Amanda's crises, he simply left on a business trip, leaving her alone with the 3 children. But I also found out Amanda, in a manic episode, had spent $30,000 of the family's savings over a weekend. That once she forgot to pick up the twins from school and they were found waiting in the rain 2 hours later. That Emma had called 911 during a severe depressive episode because mom wouldn't wake up and she thought she was dead. Do you understand the problem? There were no good or bad here. There was a sick woman trying to be a mother, a distant man trying to protect his children, and 3 children caught in the middle, loving both, needing both, suffering because of both. The weeks before my decision were hell. I reviewed precedents, consulted with child psychiatrists, talked to bipolar disorder experts, read studies on maternal separation and child development, on stability versus emotional bonds. The law was clear in certain aspects. The well-being of the minors was the priority. Stability was fundamental. But what is stability? A present parent you don't know, or a sick mother who loves you. My husband found me crying one night while reviewing files. Photos of the children with Amanda before the diagnosis. Genuine smiles. Real hugs. Then recent photos. The same hugs but with worried eyes. Children who loved but also feared. The day of the ruling arrived. The courtroom was full, family from both sides. The lawyers, the social worker, and in the last row, quietly seated, Emma and the twins with their paternal grandmother. They weren't supposed to be there, but Emma had insisted. She wanted to listen. She wanted to know who was deciding her future. I stood up, looked at the document before me, and I knew no matter what I read, someone would leave that room broken. I awarded primary custody to Robert. Amanda's scream echoed through the room, a sound I still hear in my nightmares. Pure pain. Pure loss. But it wasn't over. I set strict conditions. Robert had to reduce his travel or quit his current position. He had to attend family therapy. The children had to have access to ongoing counseling. And Amanda. Amanda would have supervised visits initially, increasing progressively if she maintained consistent treatment for 6 months. After 1 year of proven stability, we would reevaluate shared custody. I also ordered something unusual. That Robert pay for a part-time assistant for Amanda. Someone to help her maintain her medical regimen, attend therapies, prepare for visits with the children. Because I understood something fundamental. Punishing mental illness helped no one, especially not those children who needed their mother to heal. Robert's family protested. They considered it too soft. Amanda's family also protested. They considered it too harsh. Emma looked at me from the last row. She wasn't crying. She just looked at me, with those eyes that had seen too much, and she nodded, barely noticeable, but I saw it. That night I wrote in my journal something I had never written before. Today I broke a family, hoping that one day they can rebuild better than they were. 18 months passed. One day I received a letter. It was from Emma, now 13. She wrote that Mom had been stable for 14 months, that they visited twice a week and every other weekend. That Dad had accepted a local job and now they had dinner together every night. That Sophia no longer had nightmares, that Lucas had stopped drawing empty houses. And she wrote something that made me cry. You didn't give us the family we wanted. You gave us the family we needed time to become. Thank you. 3 months later, both parents returned to my court. Together, requesting formal shared custody. Amanda presented impeccable medical records. Robert presented positive family therapy evaluations. The children presented letters, expressing they wanted time with both parents. I approved shared custody, but not without final warnings. I told them this was not a fairy tale ending, that Amanda's mental illness was chronic, requiring lifelong management, that Robert would have to remain present and involved, that both would have to always put those children first, and if either failed, I would be watching. I signed the order with a trembling hand, because I still didn't know if I had done the right thing that horrible day, 18 months ago. I will never know for sure. What I do know is this: justice doesn't always feel just. Sometimes it feels like breaking something beautiful with the hope that the pieces will rebuild stronger, like causing someone pain today to spare them greater suffering tomorrow. I am Judge Angela Thompson. I have ruled hundreds of sentences, but this one taught me that the most painful decisions are those where everyone is right and everyone is wrong at the same time, where the law tells you what to do, but humanity screams for you to stop, where saving a family means destroying it first. And that's a lesson no law school teaches you. You learn that looking into the eyes of an 11-year-old girl who had to grow up too fast, and praying to the universe that your decision allows her to be a child again someday. The case arrived on my desk on a Tuesday afternoon. in a worn manila folder that contained documents I could barely hold without feeling a knot in my stomach. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when my assistant placed it next to my coffee, and I remember thinking it seemed too thin to contain so much pain. It was the Morrison family, a surname that would soon be etched in my memory, as few have been in my 22 years in the judicial system. The Morrisons were what anyone would call a working-class family. David Morrison, the father, had worked for 18 years at a manufacturing plant on the outskirts of Atlanta. His wife, Rebecca, was a nurse at a community hospital, one of those exhausting shifts that drain the soul, but she had accepted with dignity because she loved her profession. They had 3 children: Ethan, 16, Lily, 13, and little Marcus, just 8. In the photographs attached to the file, they looked like any American family, smiling at a 4th of July barbecue, hugging in front of a Christmas tree, but those images hid a reality that was about to collapse. The conflict began when David lost his job. The plant shut down, moving production overseas, a story far too common nowadays. For 6 months he tried to find work, but his age and limited specialization worked against him. I saw in the documents how his bank account gradually emptied, how debts started piling up like storm clouds. Rebecca doubled her shifts, working up to 16 hours some days, trying to keep afloat a ship that was already sinking. That was when David made a decision that would change everything. Desperate, he agreed to participate in what he thought would be a quick way to get money. A former coworker proposed he join a freight transport scheme that, according to them, was completely legal, only they paid in cash to avoid taxes. David was not a fool. He knew something was off, but desperation has a peculiar way of clouding judgment. For 2 months, he transported boxes without asking about their contents, receiving payments that put food on the table and prevented the foreclosure of his home. They arrested him on a Thursday morning in front of his children. Ethan told me later, during one of the hearings, how he saw his father handcuffed while Marcus cried, clinging to their mother's legs. The boxes contained stolen electronic components valued at over $200,000. David claimed total ignorance, and the prosecution could not conclusively prove otherwise, but his involvement in the scheme was undeniable. He faced between 5 and 8 years in prison. But this is where the case truly became complex. Rebecca, exhausted by the stress and public shame that followed the arrest, suffered a nervous breakdown 3 weeks later. She was found unconscious at the hospital where she worked, having taken an overdose of anxiety medication. She survived, thank God, but Child Protective Services had to intervene. The children were temporarily placed with Rebecca's sister, a woman named Patricia who lived in Savannah and whom they barely knew. When the case formally reached my courtroom, it was no longer just about determining David's sentence. Now I had to decide the future of an entire family. Patricia had requested permanent custody of the children, arguing that neither David nor Rebecca were in a condition to care for them. Rebecca, recovering in a mental health facility, was fighting to prove she could be a mother again. And David, from the county jail awaiting sentencing, pleaded for mercy so he could return to his family. The hearings were devastating. I heard Ethan, a young man who should have been worrying about prom, explain with heartbreaking maturity how he could care for his siblings if given the chance. I saw Lily, barely a teenager, blame herself for not noticing the signs that her mother was at her limit. And Marcus, that 8-year-old boy, drew me a picture of their united family that I still keep on my desk as a reminder of the fragility of everything we take for granted. The lawyers presented their arguments. The prosecutor, fulfilling his duty, sought the maximum sentence for David, arguing that organized crime must be punished severely, regardless of personal circumstances. The public defender begged for a reduced sentence, probation, anything that would allow David to rebuild his life and family. The child services attorney presented evidence that the children were better adjusting in Savannah, that Patricia offered stability Rebecca could not guarantee in her current state. I spent entire nights reviewing case law, searching for precedents that would help me find a solution. I consulted colleagues, something I rarely do. I spoke with social workers, child psychologists, reintegration experts. Each opinion added another layer of complexity. The law was clear regarding David's crime, but the ramifications went far beyond the penal code. What tormented me most were the children's psychological evaluations. Ethan showed signs of severe depression. He had stopped eating regularly, and his grades previously excellent, had plummeted dramatically. Lily developed separation anxiety, panic attacks every time someone mentioned the possibility they wouldn't return to their mother. Marcus simply stopped talking for weeks, communicating only through drawings that broke the heart of anyone who saw them. Rebecca gradually improved at the center, participating in intensive therapy, showing genuine commitment to her recovery. Her doctors reported significant progress, but also warned that the stress of single motherhood could trigger a relapse. Patricia, for her part, was stable economically and emotionally, but the children did not feel her as family, rather as a strange guardian in a city that was not their home. The sentencing date approached inexorably, and I still had not found an answer that wouldn't shatter some part of this already broken family. The night before the final hearing, I could barely sleep. I stayed in my office past midnight, going over every document, every testimony, every evaluation again and again. My coffee had been cold for hours, but I kept taking mechanical sips as the words on the pages began to blur. I had handled custody cases before, sentenced parents, made tough decisions. But there was something different about the Morrisons. There were no clear villains here, only victims of circumstances that had spiraled out of control like a car without brakes going downhill. I remember that night I called my mentor, Judge Harold Chen, who had retired 3 years earlier. It was almost 2 a.m, but he answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting for my call. I told him everything, every detail of the case, and when I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said something I wasn't expecting to hear. He told me that some cases don't have a right answer, that justice sometimes means choosing which kind of pain is more bearable. It didn't comfort me, but it helped me understand that perfection was not an option on the table. The morning of the sentencing dawned gray, with that fine Atlanta drizzle that seems to hang in the air. The courtroom filled early. I saw Rebecca enter with her therapist. She looked fragile but dignified, wearing a dark blue dress that was too big on her evidence of the weight she had lost during her crisis. Patricia arrived with the children, and the contrast was painful. Lily ran to her mother with tears in her eyes, but Patricia held her firmly, reminding her they had to keep their composure. That small gesture revealed so much about the dynamic that had developed over those months. David was brought in prison uniform, handcuffs clinking as he walked. When he saw his children, his face completely fell apart. Marcus finally spoke for the first time in weeks, shouting, "Dad!" with a voice that echoed throughout the room. The guards had to prevent the boy from running to him. It was one of the hardest moments I have witnessed in my career, and I have seen many heartbreaking things. I began the hearing by reviewing all the elements of the case. I spoke about David's crime, making it clear that although I understood the circumstances that led him to make those decisions, the law could not simply ignore his actions. The prosecutor nodded satisfyingly, expecting me to sentence the full 8 years. But then I changed direction. I spoke about the family, about the context, about how the economic system had failed the Morrisons long before David made his mistake. I saw the prosecutor shift uncomfortably in his seat. Then I addressed Rebecca and the children's situation. I read excerpts from the psychological evaluations, letting the words of the children themselves fill the room. When I read the letter Ethan had written, where he described how he felt responsible for holding their family together, I heard sobs from the audience. Patricia kept her composure, but I noticed how tightly she gripped her purse. Rebecca cried silently, wiping away tears with a handkerchief that was already soaked. Then came the twists no one expected. During my private investigation of the case, something I do when I feel crucial information is missing, I discovered details not in the official record. I had contacted the director of the plant where David worked, who confirmed that David had been one of his most reliable employees for nearly 2 decades. More importantly, he revealed to me that the company had offered a relocation package to certain employees, but David never received the notification due to an administrative error. That job at another plant was waiting for him with better pay, but the letter had been lost in the system. I presented this evidence in court and saw David's face go from resignation to absolute disbelief. His life could have been completely different if a simple envelope had arrived in his mailbox. The prosecutor objected, arguing that this was irrelevant to the crime committed, and technically he was right. But I needed everyone in that room to understand the full context. I needed them to see how small system failures can create avalanches of consequences. Then I revealed something else I had discovered. Patricia, the aunt who seemed so stable and detached, had applied to become the representative of a considerable life insurance policy that Rebecca's parents had left, with the children as beneficiaries. She hadn't done anything illegal, but the application raised questions about her true motivations. When I mentioned this, Patricia turned pale. Her attorney immediately requested a recess, but I continued. The children deserved to know the whole truth about who was fighting for them and why. The hardest blow came when I called Rebecca's supervisor from the hospital to testify. No one expected this because she was not on the witness list, but I had spoken with her days before, and what she told me was crucial. Rebecca hadn't. Collapsed solely from personal stress. In the weeks leading up to her crisis, she had been trying to save a young patient in a situation similar to her own family's, and when the patient died from complications that could have been prevented with better access to medical care, something broke inside her. Her collapse wasn't weakness. It was empathy taken to the absolute limit. It was important that this record remain because it changed the whole narrative about her ability as a mother. The room was completely silent as I processed all this information aloud, weaving the pieces of a puzzle that showed a much more complex picture than the initial documents suggested. I saw Rebecca sit up slightly as if someone was finally seeing beyond her most vulnerable moment. David had his eyes closed, tears falling freely as he absorbed that his desperate sacrifice had been unnecessary. Then I took a 30-minute recess. I needed that time not to decide I already knew what I had to do, but to prepare myself emotionally to say it out loud. I sat in my office looking out the window as the rain finally intensified and thought about all the families who had passed through my courtroom, all the lives my decisions had affected. This case, the Morrisons, represented something bigger than themselves. It represented everything broken in our system, from the economy to mental health, from social services to the judicial system itself. When I returned to the courtroom, the silence was almost deafening. I took a deep breath before speaking, aware that every word I uttered would carry an incalculable weight on the lives of 5 people who looked at me with a mixture of hope and terror. I began by establishing the legal facts clearly and directly, without embellishment. David Morrison was guilty of document fraud and embezzlement. The facts were established. He himself had admitted them. The sentencing range recommended by state guidelines was 6 to 8 years in prison, and the prosecutor had asked for the maximum. But I had judicial discretion, and that discretion is both a power and a burden that weighs differently each time you exercise it. I looked directly at David as I spoke. I told him I understood his desperation, that I could clearly see his actions did not stem from greed, but from paternal love pushed to the extreme of panic. I told him there were men sitting in my courtroom every week who had stolen for drugs, for luxury, for pure greed, and he was not one of them. But I also told him something he needed to hear, that his decision, though motivated by love, had been profoundly wrong, that there were other options he had not explored, other paths he had not taken because pride and fear blinded him. I saw him lower his head, accepting the truth of my words. Then I pronounced the first part of my sentence, 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months if he completed rehabilitation and job training programs. I heard Rebecca's muffled cry, saw Patricia straighten up in her seat in surprise. The prosecutor stood to object, but I stopped him with a gesture. I reminded him that justice was not just punishment, that it must also consider rehabilitation and context. David closed his eyes tightly, and I couldn't tell if it was relief or pain that crossed his face. Probably both. But that was only the beginning. I imposed strict conditions on his parole. He would have to participate in family therapy, attend financial education programs, perform community service specifically with organizations helping families in economic crisis. I wanted his experience to serve something greater than his own redemption. I wanted him to help other parents avoid the same desperate mistakes. I saw David nod vigorously, his lips forming a silent thank you that reached my heart in a way I hadn't expected. Then I turned my attention to Rebecca, and I felt the entire courtroom hold its breath. This was the decision that would truly break or rebuild this family. I spoke about her history as a mother, citing teachers, neighbors, even Patricia herself when she described in her initial testimony how Rebecca had been an exemplary mother for years. I spoke about her career as a nurse, about how she had devoted her life to caring for others, and how that same instinct had contributed to her breakdown when she felt she could not protect her own children. Then I spoke the words that would change everything. I was ordering that custody of the 3 children be returned to Rebecca Morrison, effective immediately. Lily's cry of joy echoed throughout the courtroom before Patricia could stop her. Ethan covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. Marcus just looked at me with those big eyes that had seen too much for his young age, but I was not finished. There were conditions, many conditions, because although I trusted that Rebecca could fully recover, protections needed to be in place. Rebecca would have to continue weekly therapy for at least 2 years, with quarterly evaluations submitted to the court. She would have to participate in a support program for single parents with mental health challenges. More importantly, I was ordering the implementation of a community supervision system where social workers would make regular visits, not as a threat, but as support. I wanted to create a safety net around this family, not because I distrusted Rebecca, but because no one should have to navigate this kind of recovery completely alone. But here came the twist that no one, absolutely no one, saw coming. I ordered Patricia Morrison to maintain a role in the children's lives, but completely redefined. Instead of being a threat to Rebecca's custody, she would be designated as a support guardian with structured visitation rights, 1 afternoon a week and 1 weekend a month. I saw Patricia open her mouth to protest, but I continued before she could speak. I told her in front of everyone that I had seen her life insurance application, that I had investigated her finances and found she was in a better economic situation than she had initially declared. The courtroom tensed completely. I told Patricia she could choose. She could accept this new arrangement, where she would continue to be an important part of her nephew's lives but without total control, or she could reject it, and I would order a full investigation of her motivations and representations to the court. I saw her lawyer whisper urgently in her ear. She looked at me with a mixture of anger and humiliation, but finally nodded. She had no real other option, and we both knew it. Then I did something else, something technically outside my jurisdiction, but that my conscience would not allow me to ignore. I ordered the county social services to connect the Morrison family with all available assistance programs, food stamps, housing subsidies, emergency funds, everything. Additionally, using personal contacts I had cultivated over years of community work, I arranged for a local legal aid fund to cover the costs of reorganizing the family's debts. I couldn't erase the past, but I could give them tools to rebuild the future. I looked at each member of the Morrison family as I delivered my final words. I told them life had dealt them brutal blows, that the system had failed them in multiple ways, but they also had strengths many families never develop. I told them this sentence was not a happy ending because happy endings don't exist in courtrooms. It was simply an opportunity, a door barely ajar towards something better, and it was entirely up to them whether they pushed it fully open or let it close again. When I struck the gavel, the sound thundered through the absolute silence that had fallen over the courtroom. Then everything erupted into chaos. Rebecca ran to her children, dropping to her knees to embrace all 3, while everyone wept. Patricia stood rigidly and left the courtroom without looking back. David, still handcuffed, smiled through tears as the guards patiently waited before escorting him back. And I sat there, exhausted to the bone, wondering if I had done the right thing or simply the least terrible thing. The days following that sentence were some of the strangest of my career. Usually, once I issue a ruling and strike the gavel, the case leaves my life almost immediately. But this one was different. I found myself thinking about the Morrison family at odd hours, wondering if Rebecca had managed to get the children back home without problems, if David was adapting to prison life, if Patricia was planning some legal maneuver I hadn't anticipated. My assistant, Margaret, had noticed me distracted on more than one occasion and would simply bring me coffee without asking questions. She had worked with me long enough to know when a case had affected me more deeply than usual. 3 weeks after the sentence, I received an email from the social worker assigned to the case, Jennifer Kowalski. It was not unusual to receive updates on cases with community supervision components, but usually they were formal and dry reports. This one was different. Jennifer wrote that she needed to talk to me about a situation that had arisen, something she wasn't sure how to handle within the parameters of my judicial order. My stomach sank. 3 weeks. Not even 3 weeks had passed, and there were already problems. We met in my office on a Wednesday afternoon. Jennifer was a woman in her mid-30s with that tired but determined look developed by all who work too long in social services. She sat across from my desk and pulled out a folder that was noticeably thick for such a short time. She told me the situation with the Morrison family was complicated, but not in the way I feared. Rebecca was religiously complying with all requirements, attending therapy, participating in support groups, and had even started working part-time at a community clinic. The children were adapting better than expected, although Marcus still had nightmares, and Ethan had become protective of his mother in a way that concerned the therapists. The problem, Jennifer explained with an expression I couldn't fully decipher, was Patricia, but again, not in the way I expected. Patricia was not violating the visitation order or trying to manipulate the system. She was complying exactly with the terms I had established, arriving on time for scheduled visits, returning the children on time. But there was something in the way she interacted with them that had caught Jennifer's attention. During supervised visits, Patricia had begun talking to the children about their father, about Peter Morrison, in ways she hadn't before. Jennifer opened her folder and showed me notes she had taken during supervision sessions. In one, Patricia had told Lily about how Peter used to take her to the park when she was a baby, how he stayed up all night when she was sick. She had shown Ethan pictures of Peter at university, talking about the dreams her brother had before the illness consumed him. With Marcus, the youngest who barely had real memories of his father, Patricia had been particularly devoted, slowly building an image of who Peter Morrison had been before the cancer, before the financial despair, before everything fell apart. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. I asked Jennifer what exactly the problem was, because so far none of what she described sounded negative. She hesitated for a moment before answering. She told me there wasn't a problem per se, but she had noticed something in Patricia during these interactions that surprised her. Patricia cried, not in front of the children, but after, when they had left. Jennifer had found her in the parking lot on 3 different occasions, sitting in her car with her face in her hands, sobbing in a way that seemed to come from a very deep and very painful place. Then Jennifer told me something that left me completely still. During one of these occasions, she had tapped on Patricia's car window and asked if she was okay. Patricia, with red and swollen eyes, had confessed something she had never said in court, never admitted throughout the legal process. She told her she felt guilty, terribly, overwhelmingly guilty. Because when Peter was sick, when the family really needed help, she had been there physically, but not emotionally. She had visited, occasionally brought food, but had kept a careful distance from all the chaos and pain. She had protected her own peace of mind, her own finances, her own orderly life, while her brother died and her sister-in-law fell apart. Patricia had told Jennifer that after Peter died, the guilt became unbearable. That she had begun to rationalize that Rebecca was not a good mother, that the children would be better off with her, because if that was true, then her previous inaction was justified. If she could rescue the children now, she could erase the fact that she hadn't rescued her brother when she had the chance. The custody request had not been completely about the children's well-being, although she had convinced herself it was. It had been about redemption, about rewriting a story where she was the heroine instead of the bystander she had been. Jennifer closed her folder and looked at me directly. She asked if this changed anything about my judicial order, if I needed to know this information officially. I took my time to answer, because the truth was complex. On one hand, it confirmed my suspicions about Patricia's motivations, validated my decision to limit her role instead of granting full custody. On the other hand, it showed a capacity for self-examination and growth that, frankly, I hadn't expected to see. The Patricia who had been in my courtroom had been defensive, rigid, convinced of her moral righteousness. This Patricia, the one who cried in parking lots and confronted her own failures, was someone different. I told Jennifer to continue monitoring the situation, but no, this did not officially change anything. However, I asked her to pass on something to Patricia from me, unofficially, to consider starting therapy of her own, not as a legal requirement, but as a personal suggestion. That what she had done required courage, recognizing her own flaws, and that courage should not be wasted. Jennifer nodded, taking notes. Before she left, she told me something else. That in her 15 years doing this work, she had rarely seen such a broken family find ways to begin healing, and that my sentence, though unconventional, seemed to have created the space necessary for that to happen. After she left, I remained seated in my office as the sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky with oranges and pinks that seemed too beautiful for the weight of the decisions I had been carrying. I thought of all the ways that case could have ended differently. I could have given David the maximum 8 years, as the prosecutor had asked. I could have left the children with Patricia, convincing myself that financial stability outweighed everything else. I could have played it safe, followed the guidelines to the letter, protected my own career from any criticism, but I hadn't. I had taken a risk, used every ounce of judicial discretion I possessed, extended my authority to the limits of what was permissible. And now, weeks later, I was seeing the first signs that maybe, just maybe, I had made the right decisions. Not perfect, never perfect, but right within the infinitely imperfect universe in which we all operate. 6 months later, I received another update, this time a formal quarterly report that included evaluations from Rebecca's therapists, reports from supervised visits, and something unexpected: a handwritten letter from David from prison. In it, he described the programs he was participating in, how he had started teaching basic financial education to other inmates, how he spoke to Rebecca on the phone 3 times a week and could hear the difference in her voice, the strength gradually returning. He thanked me for seeing something more than a criminal in him, for giving him a chance to redeem himself without completely destroying his family in the process. But it was the last line of his letter that broke me in a way I hadn't expected. He wrote, "You sentenced us, Judge Thompson, but you also saved us. I hope someday you can understand how much it meant to have someone really see us as human beings rather than just another case." I had to close my office door for 10 minutes after reading that. Margaret, wise as always, didn't ask questions when she saw my red eyes. In my office, I have a small wooden box where I keep reminders of cases that have deeply marked me. I don't have many things there, maybe a dozen in 23 years on the bench. That night, I added David's letter to the collection. Every time I doubt myself, every time I wonder if how I sentence really matters, I open that box and remember that behind every case there are real human lives, beating hearts, hopes hanging by a thread. 2 full years had passed since I handed down that sentence when I received a call I wasn't expecting. It was a Friday afternoon, almost 5 o'clock, and I was reviewing cases for the following week when Margaret knocked on my door with that expression that means, "This is going to complicate your weekend." She told me there was a family at reception asking to see me. They didn't have an appointment but insisted it was important. When she asked their names, they said Morrison. My first reaction was panic. In my experience, when families show up unannounced after a sentencing, it's rarely to share good news. Mentally, I began running through every possible scenario. Something had happened to David in prison. Rebecca had relapsed. Patricia had violated the order somehow. Every possibility that crossed my mind was worse than the last. But I told Margaret to let them in anyway, because if there was one thing I'd learned from this case, it was that avoiding difficult things never makes them easier. When the door opened, it took me a full moment to process what I was seeing. Rebecca entered first, but this was a transformed Rebecca. She had gained healthy weight. Her hair was well cared for, her eyes clear and focused. Behind her came the 3 children, Marcus, Ethan, and Lily, all noticeably taller than in my memories. And then, to my absolute surprise, Patricia entered. The 2 women didn't look conflicted. In fact, Patricia had her hand gently on Ethan's shoulder in a way that seemed natural, familiar, not possessive. Rebecca spoke first, apologizing profusely for showing up unannounced. She explained that they had been talking as a family about something important and had decided they needed to tell me in person, that an email or a phone call wouldn't suffice. She invited me to sit down, which I found strangely amusing considering we were in my own office, but I sat anyway because the alternative was everyone standing in uncomfortable silence. It was Marcus, the youngest, who broke the ice in the way only an 8-year-old can. He told me bluntly that my photo was on their refrigerator. I was completely speechless. Rebecca laughed softly, a genuine and warm sound, and explained it was true. They had put a picture of me from a newspaper article on the fridge because they wanted to remember that in their worst moments, when everything seemed lost, there had been someone who really listened to them, who saw beyond their mistakes to their humanity. Ethan then pulled out his backpack and took out a homemade photo album. It was a collection of moments from the past 2 years. Rebecca graduating from a nursing training program, Marcus on his first day of school at a new school, Lily at a piano recital. And then there were photos that deeply surprised me. Patricia with the 3 children at a park. Rebecca and Patricia together on what looked like Thanksgiving Day, smiling awkwardly but genuinely. A photo of all of them, including a printed image of David on a video call from prison, celebrating Ethan's birthday. Patricia finally spoke, and her voice was different from how I remembered it in court. Softer, less defensive. She told me that when Jennifer had conveyed my therapy suggestion 2 years ago, she had initially been offended. She wasn't the one with problems, or so she had told herself. But the suggestion had haunted her for weeks until she finally made an appointment. In therapy, she began unpacking not only her guilt about Peter, but patterns that had existed her whole life, her need for control, her fear of vulnerability, the way she had used moral judgment of others as a shield against examining her own flaws. She told me that in one particularly difficult session, her therapist had asked what would happen if instead of trying to save Rebecca's children, she tried to help Rebecca save herself. The question had shattered her at the time because it demanded something she had never considered: trusting Rebecca, seeing her as someone capable of growth rather than just someone needing rescue. But slowly, with a lot of work and many uncomfortable conversations mediated by Jennifer, Patricia and Rebecca had begun building something new. Not exactly friendship, at least not yet, but something like a partnership. 2 women who loved the same children, trying to figure out how to coexist in their lives in ways healthy for everyone. Rebecca added that David would be released on parole in 6 months. That they had been preparing for that moment as a family, including Patricia in conversations about what the transition would be like. There were fears and concerns, of course, but also hope in a way none of them had felt in years. She told me that my sentence had not been just about legal terms and court dates. It had been a map toward a possibility none of them could have imagined on their own. I had given them structure when chaos was consuming them, but I had also given them something more precious: the expectation that they could be better than they had been at their worst. Lily, who had been silent all this time, approached my desk. She gave me an envelope and told me to open it. Inside was a drawing she had obviously made years ago, probably around the time of the sentence. It showed 5 figures, 2 adults and 3 children, all with sad faces and tears drawn with blue marker. But stuck on top of that old drawing was a new one. The same 5 figures, but this time there were 6, because Patricia was included, and they were all smiling, holding hands under a bright sun that Lily had decorated with gold glitter that was still a bit loose. She told me, with the absolute seriousness only a 10-year-old can, have that this was their family now, that it wasn't perfect and sometimes still complicated, but it was theirs and it worked, and that it had all started the day I decided they were worth saving. All of them, not just the children, but also the adults who had made mistakes. I'm not a person who cries easily, especially not in front of others. 23 years in court teach you to keep your composure, to be the steady authority figure no matter what emotions are raging beneath the surface. But at that moment, sitting in my office with this patched and rebuilt family in front of me, the tears came and I did nothing to stop them. Margaret, who had been listening from the slightly open door, quietly came in and placed a box of tissues on my desk before retreating again. We spent another half-hour together. The children told me about their schools, their friends, their hopes for the future. Rebecca told me about her work at the clinic, how helping others going through medical crises had given her a purpose she never expected to find. Patricia shared that she had started a support group for families of cancer patients, trying to make sure others didn't make the same distancing mistakes when things got tough. When they finally got ready to leave, Rebecca took my hands and looked me straight in the eyes. She told me something I will carry with me for the rest of my life, that the justice I had administered was not the kind of justice they expected. They had expected punishment or clemency, black or white, win or lose. But I had given them something different. Justice that recognized complexity, that honored both responsibility and humanity, that believed in the possibility of redemption without ignoring the weight of consequences. That kind of justice, she told me, had changed not only the outcome of their case, but the way each of them viewed themselves and others. That night, I drove home as the Atlanta sky darkened, replaying the entire visit in my mind. I thought of all the times I had doubted my sentence, all the nights I had reviewed every detail, wondering if I had done the right thing. I thought of the criticism I had received from some colleagues who thought I had been too lenient, too creative, too willing to stray from standard precedents. And I realized that every one of those doubts, every one of those sleepless nights, every moment of uncertainty had been completely worth it. Because at the end of the day, justice is not just about laws and precedents. It's about real human lives. It's about understanding that people are more than the worst things they've done, that families are more than their dysfunctions, that redemption is possible even in the most broken circumstances. Lily's drawing is now in that wooden box in my office, next to David's letter. And every time I start a new case, especially the difficult ones involving families shattered by impossible circumstances, I open that box. I look at that bright sun with gold glitter and remind myself why I do this work. Not to be perfect, not to please everyone, but to see the full humanity of every person who stands before me and to use every bit of authority I possess to open pathways to healing when possible, to justice that recognizes both harm and hope. My most painful sentence became my greatest lesson. It showed me that breaking can be the first step toward rebuilding something stronger. And it reminded me that behind every gavel I strike, every decision I sign, there are human hearts deserving to be treated with all the wisdom, compassion, and courage I can muster.